next segment, Amitav Ghosh will discuss his fiction and non-fiction, his experiments with genre and language, and the wide sweep of ideas that his books encompass. Let's invite on stage Namgay Zam and Amitav Ghosh to talk about his first novel, The Circle of Reason. And after that, do hang around because we have music all the way from Rajasthan just for you.
I am indeed very fortunate to be seated next to a person who actually needs no introduction. I was introduced to him in college, and I think in my introductory mail to Mr. Ghosh, I did say that I had to study him as a literature student in Lady Shri Ram College. So all of my friends have sent big hellos to you, are incredibly jealous of me being next to you, and do want to see documentation that I did have a conversation with you today. Yes, sorry.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me, for inviting me here. And please give your friends my very best wishes.
I will. And if they're following us live, then I think they'll be very thrilled to hear this from you. Before we start, I was thinking instead of focusing on a chronology of your work, why not start from what has been really recent in your life, the great arrangement and the book, and the conversation you've had also at the festival. But a comment that you made on the book about how art and literary fiction, you said, should respond, and you feel that there's been a lack of response. And because you've said this, then it made me think about the kind of work that you've done, your fiction as well as non-fiction work. Have those been then a response?
Yes, in some sense they have been a response. I mean, certainly I've been thinking about these issues for a very long time. And, in that way, it's so interesting to be here in Bhutan, where, in fact, people have been thinking about climate change and the environment in such interesting ways for such a long time, really. And it's especially if you compare that with the response in, say, the arts and literature. And, artists and writers think of themselves as being so advanced and so far in advance of ordinary culture, if you like. So really, it's a lesson for us, to be in a place like Bhutan, where clearly, Bhutan is a place that's, in some sense, far away from the world's nerve centers, for which I think is a very fortunate thing. But clearly, Bhutan has anticipated so many of these issues in ways that, we as writers and artists have not.
When you began writing, it was a novel, Circles of Reason. It was a year after I was born. And I was just thinking, wow, I wonder, you had done so much by that time, and so much even till date. What prompted you to begin your writing career as a fiction writer and not as non-fiction?
That's an interesting question. Actually, I was, I really began my writing career, as I think of it, as a journalist. I was a journalist with the Indian Express in New Delhi. And in those days there was no sort of writing career as such in the Indian subcontinent. Today there are so many publishers, agents, there are festivals and so on. There was none of this back then, So when I wrote my first book, I literally had to find a publisher in India. I had to take it by hand, in a sort of manuscript to various publishers, and they all looked at it and said, "Is it a textbook?" Well, now it may be a textbook, but it wasn't. It wasn't then. And I said, "No, it's not a textbook." And they said, "So what are you doing here? Go away." It was like that, It was a completely different world, a completely different circumstance. So, in a sense, my career as a writer really began as a journalist. And that's something that's really stayed with me, and that's why I still to this day often do write nonfiction. I've often done journalism, but in a sense, my true first love was always fiction. and I always wanted to write fiction. So my first book had to be a novel.
Circles of Reason, even The Glass Palace. It's always immense. There's such a breadth, I would say, not just a depth. Depth, I would say, your characters, the way you fashion your characters, but then the way your novels unfold, it's just very vast. And I was thinking, oh, who do you remind me of? And I was like, oh, okay, this is not going to be an original plot, so let me Google it. And I was right. A lot of people are reminded of Marquez. I think it's a heaviness in a way. I mean, not because Shadowlines was a text I had to study in college and I found it heavy, but just that emotion. I don't know. It's when you write, what is it that you're trying to? I mean, there's the themes that you have. You always have identity. You have the idea of the nationhood. But then again, the emotion that is left with you isn't really. It's like a burden. Do you feel light after you've unburdened yourself on all of us, your readers? It's like it's the burden you put on our shoulders.
You know, when the Shadowlines became a sort of university text, I was really kind of, I was very happy at one level, but I was also really disturbed because when I was in college, all the people you studied were dead. So I thought, this is the kind of death knell for me. And, I remember when I had to study literature, how often one would actually resent the writer, thinking, why are you making it so difficult
there was no
for me?
resentment.
Well, I certainly felt that with many of the texts that I had to read. And I can tell you that I literally every week or so, I'll get a letter from some infuriated student saying, explain to me what you meant by this, and, my teacher wants to know, and so on. So that happens to me all the time.
There's a word, one of your, actually, I was talking to a few of my friends who are also in the audience, and Bhutanese, who are so fascinated by your characters. It's, you develop them so well that they stay with you, that they become a part of you, in fact, in the way you respond to situations. For instance, a character, not that I identified with her in the Shadowlands, but she was fascinating for me, Ila, I think. And she says, nothing important happens where you are. Like she's across the ocean, of course, and she's talking to her cousin from India. And this dichotomy and then this almost a split personality or even a split imagination, how long has that plagued you for? Did the awareness come at a really young age, or was it developed over time and your experiences in Kolkata?
Well, I had a very sort of peripatetic childhood. My father was in government service, so we moved a lot and to different countries and so on. So what I was really trying to do in going back to the Shadowlines and even earlier in the Circle of Reason was really to represent the mode of life that was natural to me, which was that of movement and of being in many places simultaneously. And at that point, that was regarded as something very strange, almost you might say, because people usually wrote about just one place or one city or something like that. But I think now increasingly people recognize that we are all a part of this pattern of endless movement, So in a sense, I think the Shadowlines really represented that reality, But it's wonderful to know that for you the characters came alive and became, stayed with you. And I was talking just about these letters that people write to me. And the most wonderful letter I had was from a 14-year-old girl in Kerala. She had read the Shadowlines and she said, "Oh, sir, I really loved your book. And I particularly loved the character Trideep." And she said, "Can you please send me a picture of him?"
Which is interesting and leads me to my next question. How do you develop your characters? Because it's so much, for instance, Balaram, I think, in Circles of Reason, I'm completely fascinated by him and also by his fascination of people's skulls and the way you develop him. And it's just amazing the amount of detail that you put into a person. It could be somebody I feel like I've been talking to on a daily basis when I'm reading your book. Are they inspired by people in your life, or you put 3-4 people together in one character?
The whole thing about a character is that I think characters are never just sort of a one-on-one kind of thing. You don't just take a person and put them down on paper. It's much more complicated than that. But I have the good fortune of coming from I had a very large family. I had many uncles on both sides and many aunts, and they were all, many of them were really, really eccentric, So, and especially there was this whole tradition in Bengal in that period of, people being obsessed with obscure European sciences, like even like positivism and phrenology and so on and so forth. So all of that sort of made its way into the book, into, well, actually in all my books have some uncle or some someone who starved them off, if you like.
Besides the uncles and the aunts, then, do you have a character then from your fictional work that you could call your favorite?
No, I don't really have a single favorite like that. No.
There's no attachment whatsoever to the characters?
Oh no, there's a deep attachment to the characters. But a character, writing a character in a book is really like getting to know a friend. It takes a very long time. I mean, the character evolves as you keep writing and as you go on. In the beginning, you start with some, with a sort of shadowy impression, and it happens in various ways. Sometimes it starts with just a person you've seen, someone you've met, or sometimes even just a photograph in a book. And then you sort of take it forward, and slowly as you go on, you get to know the character better and better and better. Because, writing a novel takes years. So you live with the character for a long time, and then they so much become a part of your life. But actually, in a way, you can't let them go. One of the reasons why my last project was a trilogy of, which took me 10, 11 years, is just that. I was sick of having these characters and then, letting go of them. I wanted really to live with a set of characters for a very long time.
And the characters still live with you?
Very much so,
do
yes.
they ever spill over, or do they still haunt you when you move on to your next body of work?
Oh yes, they're always there somewhere in your head, and they're always sort of speaking to you in some way.
The theme of displacement in your books, it's expressed very keenly, and it's felt quite keenly by the reader as well. And I'm assuming that it's more people in our region, South Asia, where we've had, for instance, in your book, you've always talked about Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and the drawing of these boundaries, sometimes imaginary, sometimes physical, but really how it doesn't really make sense at the end of the day. And do you still feel that very keenly?
Well, on my father's side, what happened is that this is a story my father told me. In the 1850s, they were in their village was in Bangladesh beside a river, and the river changed course and drowned our village. So that was when my ancestors moved to India. They actually moved to Bihar, a small town called Chhapra. And I think moving to India was just about the only sensible thing they ever did. But we became, certainly I became a part of, an Indian legacy. But this memory, if you like, this memory of having roots somewhere where, which is completely distant to you and which is actually a sort of a foreign country, I think that's played a very important part in my life, just knowing this. And I'm very struck by that, especially now when I'm in Goa a lot, or here in Bhutan, where people have such a sort of profound memory of a connection with the land. In Goa, for example, people have their, they have their family temples. They have this whole memory of being tied to a certain village, and that's incredibly important for them. They return there, every year. They do devotions and all that. And this is true also of Goan Catholics and so on. But for people like myself, and really for people who've sort of emerged out of these circumstances of partition and so on, that tie to the land, that the breaking of that tie to the land is a profound rupture in your life, and it surfaces in ways that you don't really understand.
I actually wanted to read a quote from the Glass Palace, but then because you've talked about the partition and then the moving away and moving to, I would like to read a quote from Caroline that I've actually saved to my phone, and it's, I think, Tama, the grandmother. You see, in our family, it's about her. We don't know whether we're coming or going. It's all my grandmother's fault. But of course, the fault wasn't hers at all. It lay in language. Every language assumes a centrality, a fixed and settled point to go away from and come back to, And what my grandmother was looking for was a word for a journey, which was not a coming or going at all. A journey that was a search for precisely that fixed point, which permits the proper use of verbs of movement. After all these years in your work, have you found precisely that fixed point?
No, it was so interesting to listen to Pico this morning, and I think people who live between places, as he does, and as I do, we always have a sense of shuttling back and forth of this sort of pendulum movement in our lives, and I think it enriches us in various ways, but it also impoverishes us in ways that we perhaps don't know. So it's at this point in my life, it's just my condition. It's what I live with.
But also when you talk about this, and now I know you live in a different country and you move around quite a bit yourself as well, and I was looking at some of the reviews that people have of your work, and it's interesting. I mean, it also confirms certain stereotypes as in how Asian readers react to you, particularly South Asian or Indian readers or Bhutanese readers, and how white readers react to your work, and they do not seem to be able to identify with the structure that we speak of. Have you met people who react to you in that manner, face to face, and what has an exchange of that sort been like?
It's completely unpredictable. For example, my books are found in incredibly enthusiastic readership in Italy, and the books really seem to speak to Italians. And I, as a writer, you can tell when your book really connects, with people. And certainly, I often have that sense in Italy that there's a very powerful sense of a resonance and of people connecting with the books, and maybe it's partly due to the excellence of the translations. But yes, in South Asia, I have a completely different sort of. I mean, the immediacy of the books, I feel very much more when I am with South Asian audiences. But my books have just come out in Chinese, and I've just been doing this tour in China. And that again has been a really astonishing experience, because the audiences I've interacted with there have been so enthusiastic and so kind of warm, and I mean, it's really quite beyond anything I'd imagined.
So you've gained in translation instead of losing in translation.
I think that often happens, yes.
I'm just teasing you. But what is the experience like? Do you have, as a writer, when your original work gets translated into various languages, is there an apprehension or even an anxiety that it may not send across the message that you intended originally?
No, I don't even think about that at all. And I think if you were to think about that, you would be completely crippled. Because how do you write a book that's easy to translate? And how do you even make that an aspiration? So no, I don't think about that at all.
Moving on to my favorite book by you, actually, The Glass Palace. I haven't been able to read The Great Derangement yet, but I hope it's coming from Delhi. One of my friends is bringing it. But the quote that really stayed with me from The Glass Palace is, "To use the past to justify the present is bad enough, but it's just as bad to use the present to justify the past." What comes to mind when I read this out to you in this moment?
Well, I can tell you what I was thinking of when I was doing that, because there is a phenomenon in the world whereby when people, I'm sure everybody who's ever had who's written about India's recent history, that is to say pre-independence history, every Indian will have this kind of encounter where someone will say to them, well, what do you think? Didn't the British Empire do many things for India? Didn't it contribute in various ways? And look at all the problems you have now. Wasn't it better when before? And all that kind of thing. And certainly this was often said, especially in relation to Myanmar. It was often said in relation to Myanmar. Well, they were perhaps better off during the empire, without ever registering the fact that it was the empire that destroyed Myanmar and created the problems that Myanmar is facing right now. So I think what that quote actually refers to is exactly that. That the person there is really saying that you can't use our present difficulties to justify empire. In fact, the problems that Myanmar faced literally from the day of independence onwards, in 1947 when they got independence, there were 16 insurgencies in Myanmar. That was really the legacy of empire for Myanmar, and it's taken them 70 years to overcome it. And I must say, of all the prizes and awards my books have won, one that really matters to me is that it won the Myanmar National Literature Prize a couple of years ago, and somehow that was just very meaningful for me.
It's the sense of empathy that you have, and also that you choose to use history whenever you write your fiction novels. Was it always a conscious decision, do you think, or do you think the impulse came from the fact that you were already doing journalistic work before you began writing novels?
Sometimes when one looks back on the past, it seems like there's a coherent pattern to it, but it really isn't like that. I mean, most of the time you're just tumbling along and trying to find your way. And I've always been interested in history, and so it was inevitable that history would find its way into my books.
Do you not find that very difficult to write? And do you feel that sometimes, because of course you can be a voyeur because you're removed from that situation, but sometimes do you feel the responsibility to be able to write in a manner that would justify a history that you are aware of?
As a writer, I feel that my responsibility is to the characters, not to an abstract history as such. I'm not a historian. Historians sit down and pass judgment on the past and decide what was good and what was bad, and that's not really my job. I really think that to me, history is something which doesn't have a pattern. Within the European tradition since the Enlightenment, they've always thought of history as being a progressive forwards movement directed towards some end, which is a constant betterment, constant sort of progress and so on. I don't believe that at all. I don't believe that history has these patterns. I don't believe that these patterns are discernible. And if anything, if any pattern were to be discerned within history, it would be precisely this, that of the Great Derangement, where actually history is propelling us towards some very, very dark point, So to me, I don't feel at all compelled, as it were, to pass judgment on history. But at the same time, what I will relentlessly do is if someone tries to say to me that, this institution or that institution made things better, I'm certainly going to scrutinize that very, very rigorously.
But then wouldn't you also say then, because your book, The Great Derangement, is an advocacy to fight climate change and then to accept that this is a great danger and threat to our world, then it's almost as if you've passed a judgment too, because there's a certain bias there. You've decided to advocate for a cause. This is why you're saying art and literature should react and should respond.
When you read the book, you'll see it's not a book about. It's not an advocacy book at all. I don't think of myself as an advocate or as as a campaigner or an activist. Not at all. My book is not at all a book of advocacy. I think in many ways it's, I would say, I don't know what to advocate. I don't know what the solutions are. And frankly, if you ask me, I don't think we are past the point of solutions, So actually, my book comes from a far darker place than you would imagine. It's not about advocacy at all. I'm really reflecting on the catastrophic failure that this point in history represents. Failure which is not just a failure of politics, it's also a failure of the imagination. I think it's principally and fundamentally a failure of the imagination, and that's really what I'm looking at.
When you say the failure of the imagination, then you share it with me with a sense of disappointment. Besides disappointment, is there also anger?
I think I feel a great sorrow. I feel a sorrow for anyone who has children. Must feel a sense of sorrow for the world that they're heading towards. But also, in a way, when you have anyone who looks at the climate science seriously, knows what's coming. It's not a secret. It's out there. You just have to read it, and you know what's coming. And once you know that, once you recognize the dimensions of the crisis, it's actually, in many ways, a very clarifying thing. It makes you have to think about what is important in life. Every crisis that human beings confront force you to that position where you have to sort of clarify, you have to think about, what is important in life. So in that way, I wouldn't say that it's that it's all that it's all sorrow or whatever. I think it's at this moment that it also makes you understand that you have to live mindfully. You have to live noticing the world around you. You have to take joy in your family, in your children, in everyone who's around you. You have to love the things that this life has given us. You have to love the food that the earth gives us. So there's so much that actually you can do to celebrate what we have. Also, I think the other thing that we should really celebrate is actually the thing that we broke away from, which has created this crisis, which is there were ways of living, there are ways of living which would have led to something different. We should not forget that. So that isn't something else to remember, something else to celebrate, and something else to wonder about.
Then feel that the imagination is something that you feel you should bequeath to future generations, that it should be a legacy, that's something you leave behind, that you see the imagination as being something alive, and you share it every moment with everybody else.
Look, I think one really has to confront the question of, what is the legacy of the arts and literature? I mean, this is something I've dedicated my life to, is writing books and writing fiction and so on. But, just think of a moment when, say, the city of Mumbai is underwater, or the city of Chennai is underwater, or Kolkata, my birthplace, is underwater. What will future generations say to us? They're not going to look back on our work and say, well, we celebrate all the wonderful things you wrote about identity and so on. What they're going to say to us is, why were you blind to what is happening? Why were you blind to what was around you? In relation to in the 1950s and 60s, after the Second World War, children used to say to their parents, "What did you do during the war?" And that was the hard question for people to answer. I think for my generation, this is the question that we will have to face from the children, the generations ahead. What were you doing when the world was literally suffocating?
I just remembered that I had actually written a quote from the Shadow Lines on the imagination. I could not persuade her that a place does not merely exist, that it has to be invented in one's imagination. It fits in with what you just shared with us about how it's really everything that you shared, and also it takes me back to the conversation I had with Pico in the morning, where he says the home is really within, and you try to look for it without.
I always learn so much whenever I listen to Pico. And I always feel like I'm sure everybody else feels, that I wish I were Pico. I wish I could find, the kinds of stillness that he finds and so on. But for me, I think for me, what this moment has really brought is actually a movement away from the self, a movement away from inwardness. I feel really that, what I want to value and treasure and get more and more of is my relationships, with my friends, with my family, with people I love, and, with the world around me. So I feel that, this is a moment for me when I feel like opening out my arms and embracing the world around me.
When people critique your work, they say there's a lot of preoccupation with the individual. And I want to bring this up in the context of the refugee crisis that we have globally. And there was an African writer who was at the UN who said, why are we looking at refugees as one person and an individual when it isn't that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the refugee crisis is certainly an example of something which is completely a collective phenomenon and which has to be addressed at that level, yes.
At this point, I'm thinking, is Pramod around? Do we want to take questions at this point?
That boy over there had a question. I saw him raising his hand, which he shyly retracted.
It's a good opportunity to ask Mr. Ghosh, a question, because you'll be studying him in college, so you can reference it in the future, in a few years' time. We didn't have access then. What about, you were telling me that you've traveled to Bhutan. This is your first visit to Bhutan, in fact. What has the experience been like for you? Because I'm assuming that as a writer, as an author, and as a journalist, every experience feeds into your imagination and then it grows. Do you find things, when you come to Bhutan, you're coming with a set of expectations. Do they correspond to something in your memory, or is it something new that is being created for you from this experience?
I think it's wonderful to be, I mean, it's been so actually instructive to be in Bhutan and just to see, I mean, everybody knows what a beautiful country this is, how wonderful the people are, but it's also, you know, you discover a different mode of living, you know, in every sense, that is an attentiveness to certainly the environment and the climate and so on. But also I think, you know, I grew up in a democracy. I've always lived in democracies, and you know, democracy is a wonderful thing. But there are also aspects of democracy which, you know, one really does have to sort of think about. You know, one of which is that within all democratic systems are essentially founded upon ideas of adversarialism. You know, that is, everything is always adversarial. You know, and we see the sort of results of that, you know, all the time, you know, playing out, you know, across the landscape, whether it be in the United States or India or wherever. So, you know, when you see a different way of approaching what you might call a political community, I think it's something which really is very interesting and instructive and something to be learned from.
What is the one thing that would stay with you when you leave Bhutan, when you're leaving Bhutan tomorrow?
Well, I think the thing that will really stay with me is my visit to the farmers market, because, you know, I love to see how food is grown, how food is presented, and this farmers market was just completely, I mean, it blew me away. I was astonished by it. Just the incredible variety of produce that's there, how well it's displayed, how beautifully the market is kept. I just found myself wishing that I had a kitchen so that I could buy this food and go and cook it. It just looked so wonderful. That gentleman over there has a question, I think. He's, okay.
I was thinking you're going to say, I was wishing that I could sit and write about this experience, but you said, I wish that. Well, if you weren't a writer, what would you have been?
I have no idea what. I don't think I could have done anything else, frankly. I mean, writing is, you know, there are writers who are also good at singing, who are also good, you know, good at, some are politicians and so on. I have no other talents. You know, I can't sing.
I don't think you need any other talents.
So this is the only thing I could have done, and I feel very fortunate, you know, that I can.
Is there a space in between where you're not thinking about writing, or where you're not thinking about expressing? Is there ever a lull? Do you experience a lull in between?
You mean like a writer's block kind of thing?
This block, but just a space when you're sort of removed from the experience as a teacher or the journalist, and this is just a breathing space for yourself. Do you ever occupy such a space?
You know, I always feel that I'm racing to keep up with everything I want to say. So no, I mean, you know, once I finish with one thing,
I think you need to go and attend a retreat that Pico goes to.
But you know, writing for me is a retreat. I mean, I spend like years in my study, hardly meeting anyone, hardly ever leaving the house, seeing nobody but my family. So, you know, this is not my life. I mean, going out and, you know, meeting audiences is not my life at all. A writer's life is really a life of retreat, a life of profound solitude and isolation. And, you know, young people often ask me, you know, for advice about writing, and I always tell them, you know, if you don't like solitude, you shouldn't be a writer, because that's really what it is. It's a complete retreat from the world.
Was the commitment instant for you then, when you decided to do a full-length novel with Surface of Reason in 1986, or did it happen gradually for you, that you knew that this was something long-term and that you'd have to work on it gradually?
you know, at that point in my life, I think I was about 25 or 26, and I said to myself that if I don't write a novel now, I will never do it. So, you know, I just sat down and started writing it, and you know, it was when I look around the world and at people who write and so on, I see many, many writers who are incredibly talented. I see many people who are incredibly talented. You know, it's not the talent that's the hard part. The hard part is just, you know, getting it done. You know, just, you know, sitting down and getting it done. And, you know, to write a novel requires an incredible amount of discipline. You know, I mean, to produce 180,000 words is an act of physical labor. You know, I mean, because you really can't write more than, say, 500 or 1,000 words a day over the long term. So, you know, it's a very testing, it's a very testing thing. It's a real test of endurance, you know, and it requires an incredible discipline, you know, over not just over a day or 2 days, over decades. And it's really, in that sense, it's like any of the arts. I mean, you know, like I think of it most of all in relation to music. Like, you know, just as a musician has to sort of practice every day, just so that they can hear the notes. It's the same with writing. I mean, when I'm not writing for like, say, 2 or 3 weeks, it takes me months to be able to get back to writing.
I'm very curious to find out who your favorite author would be, or another body of work that you've enjoyed immensely. Who does Amitav Ghosh read?
It's hard to say. I mean, you know, I read very widely. There's all kinds of writing that I love to read. So there's, you know, that's a very difficult question to answer. I can't give you a single answer. You said Marquez, and I love Marquez. I really admire Marquez's work. So let that be the answer.
I'm big at Marquez, and I think it was a big compliment to Sir yourself.
Absolutely, yes.
It's been wonderful being able to, I mean, after I was introduced to your work in college, and then to not be reading your book as a student, but as somebody who enjoys reading, and then to grow with that experience and to let it seep into you, the experiences that you write in your book. Have other readers also said that to you, that it's almost as a, it's a process of osmosis, I would say?
Yeah, I mean, for me, writing or reading most of all is actually a process of entering someone else's world. You know, you have a whole new world opening up, and you're in it. It's like a kind of time travel almost. So I love that about reading and about writing. You're making a world that other people can enter.
And finally, my last question is, as an Indian writing primarily, actually, well, I'm assuming, but the expected audience is also Indian. Do you think, as an Indian author, from your time and also the upcoming writers, you'll be able to separate yourself from the structured imagination that we spoke of? Or do you think this is going to be a baggage that's going to be everybody's baggage, no matter which year or generation you're born in?
You know, we talk a lot about culture and cultural moorings and so on and so forth. But what I see really in the world around me now is that so many aspects of what we thought of as culture, as something very deeply rooted, all these things are disappearing. I mean, for example, you know, as a child, I remember being brought up by my parents, always, you know, they've always said the Indian way is that you don't get into debt, you're very careful not to waste, you're careful to save. But now, when I'm in India, you know, every time I open my computer, it's like some bank is trying to get me into debt. You know, I mean, the whole sort of young Indian middle class is now completely living in this debt cycle in the same way that Americans are. So really, what are the moorings of the culture that are left? I don't see it anymore. It's completely, it may not have completely vanished, but it's certainly in the process of vanishing.
Which isn't the most encouraging note to end our session on. but I think there is hope somewhere. I mean, even if the older culture moorings would have disappeared, perhaps there's something else that could be an anchor for the newer generation.
On that happy note, let us end.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ghosh. Thank you.